We can learn a lot from history, but I think we learn more so from the people within it. And there is perhaps no figure more important in this world and continent than the first conquering queen of the skeld, the mighty Stygitte, famed for being one of the best strategists and rulers of the Age of Madness, and is the reason the skeld went from nothing more than a small city-state to a near-immortal kingdom and powerhouse on the continent. And she is almost purely responsible for this, and I think her tale is a fascinating one. So sit down a moment, and I shall tell it to you. See, the origin of the skeld people is actually quite old, as they were one of the many city-states of the grasslands that have been around since the primeval age. They were known for few things, such as being slightly matriarchal, and being some of the few city-states that the dragon riders are quite common in, which led to their more decadent nature. Stygitte was born into the royal family, but she was not like most in the family. She was a fighter, and very tough for her age. Some even accused her of being a bully in her younger days, pushing around the other kids to doing what she wanted them to do. But she did have a very rebellious nature, and was seen as a disgrace by some in the royal line at the time. She ran away constantly as a teenager, and spent quite a lot of time fighting. But eventually she did come of age, and when her mother died, she took the throne, and was not happy with the current state of affairs. She viewed the army as foolish, decadent, and wasteful. And in truth, the Sun Chaser Corps was just that. However, as most were of a noble lineage, she could not just throw them aside and start from scratch like she wanted. She ended up giving the Sun Chasers a very special offer. Their families could keep noble rights and would become high-ranking officers in the new standing force dubbed the Wind Guard. But in reality, they acted just like the usual soldiers, just with fancier titles and better-looking armor. She also disbanded the standing army, making the Dragon Riders and the main fighting force one in the same. And this is very relevant when it comes to the wars she fought early on, as the city-states did not get along and were constantly at war with one another. But usually, all this resulted in was the loss of many lives and money changing hands. Stygitte, however, upon winning one of these wars in her early days, decided that this was the end of it. She would not let those who died go in vain, and not want to fight this foe again. So she claimed the city that they owned as a new Skeldian province. The other city-states, seeing this as little more than an aggressive expansion, quickly formed a coalition to strike her down before she could do too much to stop them. They launched a combined attack with all of their forces, but their mostly standing army was very little match to the newly formed Wind Guard, and their assault was crushed swiftly and near decisively. This valiant victory was not unnoticed by the outside world at large, and some grew weary of the Skeld's new growing power. But some saw this as an opportunity, such as the ancient dragon Hjalgund, who saw the young queen as the unifier, and sought her out for this reason. See, the dragon is hailed and famed as an ancient being, and according to some myths, he is in fact a demigod. He is the famed firstborn son of the god Hjalgund, the god and guardian of the land. And Hjalgund was said to be tasked with protecting the land of the city-states. But Hjalgund was in truth worried about their future and fate. Their broken nature and small size made them quite vulnerable, and he was waiting for a ruler to come along and unite the region. And after seeing Stygitte crush the coalition formed against her, gave the old dragon ideas. He approached the young queen, humbling all those around her, causing some to kneel before the divine being, and others to flee its mere presence. But Stygitte stood proud and merely nodded her head. And in return, the dragon did the same. The two bonded very quickly after this point, having many meetings and were considered friends. They even became mountain rider, and it was quite often that Stygitte sought out his guidance in many affairs. And with their might combined, the two of them conquered the land of the city-states, where Strigitte's ambition ended. She viewed her campaigns as over, and rested her newly conquered lands, hoping to integrate them into the skeld's domain over time. But Hjalgund had other plans. He wanted her to go beyond, conquering more and more of the land and expand the borders of the skeld to unseen heights. Stygitte was opposed to the idea at first, but over the years, the wise Hjalgund changed her opinion and, in some ways, manipulated her, and changed her judgment into being more violent over time. And one day, he eventually got what he wanted, changing her opinion on the matter and forcing her to expand. At first, she merely expanded into smaller lands and unpopulated areas, sending out colonists to many islands and barren regions. But after a raiding party from the Valkyrian range destroyed a large caravan and injured one of her family members, she had had enough and was convinced fully to conquer the lands of the south, to deal with this threat before it becomes too much of a nuisance. And the wars of sovereignty had begun, much to the joy of Hjalgund, who personally led most of the campaign. This war saw some of the worst atrocities committed by the skeld, and was the longest conflict in Strigitte's entire career as a ruler, lasting at least 20 years of her life. But the war was finally won, when a large group of marauders swapped sides from the southern tribes and aligned with the skeld for the conflict, causing the war to finally end. For their efforts, Stygitte gave them a castle within the newly taken land and made some of them nobility. Their descendants still hold this title to this day. These marauders took up the red armor and are now quite famous throughout the land, and are almost seen as the stereotypical marauder, one most of which are based off or split off from. They are the famed loners and noble monster slayers, true successors to Rongard's teachings, but we'll get to those another day. But over the years, the crown began to grow weary upon her head after conquering the lands and aggressive expansion of the borders, and she realized that these borders could not be held, at least not via great time and effort, so she could not hold them in her lifetime. And the first to leave was Sargild. Well, they tried to negotiate their independence as soon as possible, and Stygitte didn't really want to bother with it, and their money was certainly needed, so she allowed their independence via an exchange. The few provinces they took throughout Neador also were given up, as it was hard to hold these provinces, and their value, though explicit, was not worth the military effort, so they were given independence again. And at this point, the rebellions in the south began as a bloody campaign, and something Stygitte spent the rest of her life trying to stop. She would not give up these southern lands. They were too valuable and useful, with minor populations that she didn't think were too much of a threat. Sadly, she was wrong. Her death came all the same, years later, and the conflict very soon became one-sided without her guidance. The Jarlentyr became independent again and took most of their land and a good portion of the Valkyrian range with them, aligning with many tribes that didn't stay with the skeld. But the vast kingdom remains as a whole, and Strigitte's descendants still sit on the throne to this day, ruling over a vast, mighty kingdom. Hjalgund viewed his work as done, and was given the title of the Realm's Guard. a holy position, held by some to have special powers over the nation, a religious figure of sorts. In many regards, he's as powerful as the current reigning queen, but he is far more isolated in his nature and his role, becoming more secluded, and leaving the title of royal mount to another dragon. And that dragon is Aelion, who has been with the royal family ever since. In the end, she left a magnificent legacy, as a conqueror and a mother of an enormous kingdom as well as her own children, whose descendants still sit and rule upon this land to this day. And given how much we still talk about her, it is evident that her legacy is one to be envious of. And in fact, I suspect most foreign rulers are envious of. Regardless, that is her story in history, and I thank you for listening to my tales. I am the Ashspawn. Feel free to leave a like, comment, or subscribe. It would really mean a lot to me. But, till next we meet, fellow traveller, have a good day.